so that we can get started. Yeah. So just to orient Pospi, do you want to frame the question, Sam?
No, I'm fine for you to do it. I'm just going to sit quietly and take notes and get some kind of a plan together based on people's needs.
Cool. So like the invite suggested, we're exploring HoloREA today, and in particular, how it fits into modular design and how it might be relevant for your project. And so what we could do is just a quick one-liner or two-liner on what brought you here today, or what you might be specifically looking to get out of from this discussion about HoloREA. Yeah.
I've been waiting to get my head around HoloREA for a long time now. And every now and then I dip in and I read a little bit, and yes, I'm really keen to see where you're at with that. I'm working a lot in the online accounting space, and so comparing where the similarities are and where the differences are, it's going to be really good, and seeing how we can use that in other applications.
I guess I'll go. My name's Kamal. I'm working on Basin, trying to basically see if we can use HoloREA to test a small prototype, focused on food lasts or food waste to a digester, and then from the digester to a farm. So what do those flows look like? How does delivery work? How does the transactions work? Can we apply credits? So that's what I'm working on.
Digester, is that a composting system?
Yes, correct. Mm-hmm.
Right.
I'll go next. I'm Greg. I've built 9 renewable energy grids in a small country called Liberia in West Africa. Our main grid is in a village called Quendine that has a waste to energy system that was constructed in Berkeley, California, and then we installed it in this little village that takes wood chips and coconut husks and turns it into electricity. So the HoloREA could fit into our system where we're trying to build some tools for these villages.
Thanks.
Cool. I'm Michael. I'm more on the software side. I don't have any particular like motivating business case, but I kind of came to find REA from the P2P Foundation and contributive accounting. Yeah, broadly very interested in how we can fund the development of open systems, because the dominant funding model of software seems right now is this enclosure and kind of client server architecture where you don't own your data. So it seems like how do you fund things that are open and you're giving them away? And so to me, this is all tied together in tracking value flows.
Sam, not possibly the other Sam, do you want to share? Maybe he's away, but maybe I can share. For me, I've been following this conversation around modularity. Like I feel I'm really fascinated by that, and how Holochain is bothing like these models around modularity, like everything, kind of what Michael was referring to, like new ways in which value flows and new ways in which software collaborates with other bits of software. And so for someone who's thinking about designing the projects in that way, I'm curious to hear about how HoloREA fits in. And maybe there isn't one answer, but I think this could be a good place to even open up that exploration. Yeah, and Sam, what else do you want to share? The question?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep, Thanks. So maybe I'll just introduce myself to the group because I can see there's some people I've not met before. So my name's Sam. I'm based in Melbourne in Australia. So I've been following HoloChain for a while. And I'm also involved on a project, a platform co-op called Loconomics, which is in Australia is copied from an open source project from the USA. So that's and we are involved actually in something that's might be of interest to people for HoloChain is the new school in New York has started a platform co-op sort of incubator, which is 8-week course. It's only $150, so it's pretty much just making sure people are interested. I can share a link, and if you do have a project or you want to get involved on a platform co-op project in your area, because it's global, they'll probably have a bunch of projects in your area. I had a look the other day, there's 70 projects across the world. So I'll share a link with that if anyone's interested in getting on board. And if you're in Australia, getting on board with Loconomics would be great. I'd love to see people helping out with what our project is. So I'll share a couple of links just while everyone's chatting.
Thanks, Sam. And before Pospi shares, I'd just like to share that I just want to say thanks to Pospi for stepping up and sharing here, because he's been a little concerned that the REA project isn't quite ready. And so he had a few concerns about it, but I think it's great that he's still here and exploring with us. So yeah, really grateful that he could do this.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, it's all a work in progress, and today is kind of more of a work in progress than usual because I'm updating HoloChain platforms and things. So it'll be fun because it'll be kind of rough and ready and look through the guts of some of it. Yeah, I mean, I still kind of have a bit of a format for this based on the notes that you put out to the community, Sid. I think maybe there's some of this other stuff, these particular contexts we can touch on as examples as we go through the process, maybe, particularly Kamal's stuff potentially. But I guess we start with how you should be thinking about HoloREA value flows and its utility for your project, yeah, and trying to do a bit of an overview kind of thing. Always comes out different depending on the group. With this one, it might be worth actually talking through some of the biodigester stuff that Kamal is doing. And maybe even, it sounds like there's a lot of overlap with Greg's stuff as well. We can probably even do some of it live too. Let's, oh, I can't share my screen. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. If you can forcibly share my screen even, that is an option. Can't hear you, Sid, sorry if you're...
Should be able to do it now. Give it a try.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yep. Oh,
it's a big screen. It will
no.
take a while to come through.
It's still blank. There you
go. Yeah, so maybe a good kind of foundational frame for this kind of stuff that I've been toying with recently is the idea of economies of knowledge, or economies of, what's the other word I said here? Yeah, let's go with economies of knowledge. When you start building out things in this way using these particular kind of general purpose low level building blocks, and when I say these particular in REA, it's kind of like, you know, these low level economic components that you can assemble to any economic systems. Turn my timer off. So that's a good place to start, because it's like, okay, let's just assume for now that REA can drive all of the internals of how resources move in your economy and manage all the supply chain logistics and inventorying stuff, because that's kind of one of the main things it does. So the question becomes, beyond those physical things, what is the extra intelligence and wisdom and analysis that is necessary for your particular domain? There is in the HoloREA repository as an example folder and a couple of just stubs really at this point fleshed out, but these are extensions of some of the core zones. So this is all agent registration stuff over here. So this one is an extended zone module that basically just wraps the core specification module, and just to kind of some knowledge, I think. Yeah, so the core specification module basically gives you these things. Describes types of resources, types of processes, and that gives you a way of defining everything that's running through your economy. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but...
Sorry, Pospi, could you make your font bigger?
Yeah, sorry. How's that?
Just hasn't changed. Oh wait, it's doing something.
Yeah.
One more? Yeah.
One more?
Yeah. One more, I think. Just that orange that doesn't resolve very well on my screen.
Okay. All right, we'll go.
I'm on an old laptop, so yeah, that's good. Thanks.
No worries. So one of the first things you can start to do is extend these specifications, because most of the resources in an economy, you're going to link to a specification to say this is the type of resource it is. And I might actually show you, there's an example in here that I've been using, just some stuff off the internet. This is a vocabulary for agricultural produce and processes and things. So this is just an identifier to say this is avocados according to the agro vocab. And there's, you can do an enormous amount of research on this stuff if you are working on kind of like a big industry use case and you're going for widespread adoption in a vertical, because there are these kinds of semantic web grammars, they're called, out there that have these big knowledge databases of, I mean, you can see it's got all these other translations of the fruit and different schemes it's in, and you'll find heaps of other like species it's members of and subspecies and all kinds of things. It all hangs off there. So those are good existing resources to start building a lot of knowledge into an economic system or an information system like this. Yeah, so when you start building stuff, a good thing you can start doing is just creating, I mean, it's actually one of the first things most people do is defining the types of resources that are going to be in their economy. Maybe we can talk through some of the stuff that flows through the biodigester, Kamal, and what kinds of analyses you might want to make on it, on those materials that are sort of particular to your what's the word I'm looking for? Your use case, anyway. Does anything come to mind immediately when I say that? Oh, you're muted. Sorry, Kamal.
Oh. Was that a question to Kamal?
Oh, go ahead, please. Oh, I was just saying the inputs right now, there's tofu. So, it's pretty soft. And then they want to get to the next level where there's more inputs like vegetables.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So there's ways, it depends on you and how you want to build it, what you would evolve here. I mean, with this kind of simple stuff, if you're just putting in some tofu is going to go in, some vegetables going to go in as different classifications, then you can just use the standard routes and create resource specifications that give it some term to differentiate, basically. I've been thinking, there might be more complex situations where you might want to put in, like, say, a set of types of ingredients, and it generates you a unique type based on that. So, you know, this one's got some hard materials and some soft materials. This one's got liquids, that kind of stuff. So in those cases, you might end up with kind of additional fields extending these base properties of a resource specification that add extra metadata to it. So you might have extra fields in here to say, you know, like, what's the word, state or something, or material state, and give that, call that an enum of whether it's solid or liquids or hot liquids, or, you know, there might be heaps of things, right? So you can add these extra fields to the schemas that you have and start building extra data in. And we can get to how that works up in the higher layers in GraphQL outside of HoloChain later if we want. But for here, it might simply be something like, you know, you take a struct for new material type, and it might have, God, it's been too long since I've written Rust to actually do this on the fly, really. Does anyone want to help me here? We can just make it a string, I guess, really, it's fine. Basically just declare, you know, whatever fields we want. I'm going to pull open some older ones so I don't have to type all this out. Let's go with resource. I've got a bunch of these. Sure, this is not idiomatic Rust, but you get the idea. And you have other parts here that map back to this resource specification. So let's put name and image and stuff in. So presuming you define some input structure like this, then you might want to take that in, and you might want to say, we're not creating this generic resource specification anymore. We're creating a material type, say. And then you might implement some things here to import, it's into, isn't it? Into response data. No, we want create request. So this is the simplest way I would probably imagine doing it. In here, you'd then say, pull the data for the actual resource specification out of it. And then you can go and create this resource specification under the hood. And then do some other logic to create the material type. And there might be something in there that sets up links to wire the two together. And then basically, you know, return your ID. So this is actually going to give you, I think, a result from memory. Oh, not delete. Let's create, that's interesting. My jump to definition's gone real weird. So it gives you back a full record, yeah. So we could just return whatever we want. We could try and sort of stitch it all together. The way I'm kind of doing these things with myself is these construct response helpers that basically take a bunch of the components that are entries and structs and things and reassemble them into a full record to return. So very rough, very hand wavy, but I hope that starts to give some idea of how you might extend the core REA framework to build more metadata around the types of resources to begin with. Does anyone want to dig any deeper on that or explore more before we go on to some other stuff?
Pospi, I think what would help me is if you could somehow show this reflected in a user interface, or how it's
I
being...
would love to. Yeah, sure. I would love to show you some user interfaces. I'm in the middle of breaking a lot of them at the moment. There's some good stuff at this is another project being built on its own ActivityPub compliant backend. So it's a HoloREA compatible backend, but it's built using WebTech. And this is one that we're actually all using at the moment because we're building this this particular interface. So this is one of the projects on this system, and we're just kind of dog fooding it to try it out and explore. But it's not really showing all the kind of knowledge system stuff that I'm talking about at the moment. This is kind of a more operational thing, just looking at some offers and requests and using REA to power that kind of interaction. The other one that's really worthwhile looking at is Shroom. And I'm sort of in the middle of poking at this and making it work with HoloREA. It's hooked up to some endpoints at the moment. There's no data coming through in the UI yet, so there's not a lot to look at here either. But this one's fairly comprehensive. There's an awful lot of, when you go and look at the pages here, lots of different things for inventory management and offers and wants matching, I think, is this one. Planning and managing processes and currency wallets and all kinds of stuff. And it's all REA. There's not more than probably, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 different record types behind all that data. Behind all those pages, just in the nature of the model and the way it's all integrated. Yeah, is that enough for now? I kind of will go into some UI stuff deeper later, but I was thinking more in terms of CRISPR.
Yeah, thanks.
So this stuff is good for extending knowledge systems, and there's not, I think, I know not all of us on the call are Rust people, but there's not a lot crazy or weird in all of that. It's just Rust crates and libraries, and there's a public API in the HoloREA crates that is gives you these kinds of methods. Receive, create, resource specification, and there's ones for reading and updating as well that kind of treat the framework largely as a black box. So my recommendation would be, when you're extending with it, to use those crates as a black box in the same way and build other things around. And if you find that there's customization you can't do, then there may well be some more modularity to be broken down in the framework. But it might also be possible that there's a way to implement that in a way that's more neatly separated from a HoloREA and prevent you having to maintain as much code. So those would be my recommendations there for people building stuff. I'll show you briefly as well, because it's when we move from kind of like the kind of knowledge that I'm talking about at the moment is all very much like type-based, it's talking about like the whole type of things, whether it's tofu or diesel or avocados or whatever. It's talking about every avocado in the network as a generic concept. So there are things you can do as well. And this custom resource attributes example I stubbed out here is one of them, where basically you're then adding extra data, not to these specification things that describe types of resources, but to the actual instances of resources themselves. And it's, as you can see, it's much the same pattern really. Like you've still got the same create, read, update, delete sort of API, and some core framework helper methods that it's calling into that are doing all the heavy lifting of managing the internal links and resources for REA. And you can do the same sorts of things as we've been doing here in these. You can, oh, I lost it. Sorry. Yeah, so you can stitch other parameters in around the event records that you're creating and wire links up and store other bits of data that add other fields, and then have your own methods that take all those pieces and reassemble them into single JSON structures to return to the outside world when you're responding. I don't know if there's much more to say about that, really. It's kind of the same thing I've already spoken about. But if there's any other questions on that initial stuff before we go too much further.
I've got a question, Pospi, but it might not be about what you're just talking about. You mentioned something about different translations of avocado. Is would this HoloREA include the ability to translate content, or is that something that people are building separately that you would then include in your project? Like, because I can imagine a lot of projects needing translations.
Yeah.
So it's a common thread, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I've not yet built full text indexing either. I think I have seen some stuff that people have been working on to do that in HoloChain. So I think I'll probably just piggyback off that, because that's not my jam, spending 6 weeks with my head in that. And probably after full text indexing, or somewhere around the same time, is when translations might be a good time to add them. But yeah, I'd like to see that as a generic service that people can plug in and just, on any, I guess it'd have to be per field even, like not just any entry, but any field of any entry to be able to provide a translation. That'd be an amazing little utility to have.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's interesting how I've worked with PO files before. So that's like the industry standard for translation. So you create PO files, and then there's like an in-between layer, which you write your code the normal way, but then there's some in-between layer that looks to the PO file to say what the translation is, and then you have multiple PO files for all the translations for all the languages.
Yeah, I've been doing that in the UI work that we've been creating. And this Commons Pub, actually, I'm sure they've got translation in there. I mean, it's definitely high on their priority list because that's a fairly multilingual team. I've just been making sure in my UI work it goes in there early, because it's one of those things, if it doesn't go in there early, it doesn't happen, right? But there's sort of two kinds of translation in this too. Like you're talking about like just language translations of things. But there's also, and I brought up this page, there's also the ontology translation issue. So if you're using agrovoc and the definition of avocado there, that's actually probably incompatible with the definition of avocado that say like the USDA or Canonic Integrity database uses. So it's a problem that's gonna, it's a good problem to have. It's one of those problems that it means that you've got a lot of adoption if you start having that problem, but it is one that needs to be taken seriously and have a lot of time invested into. And I've kind of laid it out here as its own module because it's very much a semantic web ontologists kind of project. And I think there's a lot of groups circling around HoloChain that are interested in that kind of stuff. But I do think it's something that you'll have like an ongoing operational role in communities for, because whenever there's some other network bumping into yours trying to trade goods, you're going to need some council of people discussing whether they're the same goods or if they can be equivalented in some way. And that's, that's a on the ground thing that's nuanced and different for everybody everywhere, I think. So yeah, having an ontology module that sits in this suite that lets you manage equivalences like that and kind of also broadcast things. So if I post it into one network and tick a few boxes to be able to post it and replicate it out to 3 or 4 different broader networks, if I'm making a listing, that kind of thing. So yeah, all of that is stuff that's needed and coming at some point down the track.
Thanks.
I did want to also just touch on this module too, because it illustrates another way of extending HoloREA or just extending HoloChain apps in general, really. Like we've talked about some of these kind of low-level direct extensions where we're toying with injecting the fields around other record types. But there's other stuff that has come up in this process that we realize there's probably whole other modules that need to be built to make that done in a really robust way. For the distributed energy trading people on the call, actually, this might be a really useful thing to look at. I know I've looked into Red Grid's Internet of Energy protocol a little bit as well, and I'd love to see something around that, but it also seems like it's kind of like a very low-level protocol for embedded devices and things to speak. But this one is more about, we've got a thing to track resources and all the economic events that happen to them, but we don't have anything to track like IoT events where it's just, you know, a sensor in a shipping crate that's pinging a temperature every so often. And so it's actually kind of a little more in depth than just measuring the resource, because it's measuring particular characteristics in particular parts of the resource. Anyway, so back to semantic web vocabs, like there's this semantic sensor ontology that someone brought in this discussion, and there's a whole existing body of work on, you know, how to describe measurements taken by sensors in ways that preserves their agency and things, and it's really in depth and really useful. So yeah, just a nod there to more of those efforts being out there that are worth jumping into. And yeah, you know, this is kind of like an extension of HoloREA that is not touching HoloREA at all, like build some other module that's just another independent DNA that you can plug in, or potentially zone, depending on where we end up, I guess.
Pospi, I've got a question as well.
Yeah.
You spoke about resources. Do you see the agents as resources as well, or are they separate?
We have definitely pushed back and avoided that one when it's kind of come to us in the past. I'm trying to remember the actual project. It was something to do with staffing and staff management and things. And so they had that same notion of like, well, staff are assets in our world and we want to be able to manage these assets. And I think they might have ended up implementing something that was kind of managing like time blocks rather than people, maybe, and treating those as resources. But yeah, it's always been something that's been kind of ideologically awkward for us, like the idea of treating people as things that are moved by other people. It tends to all, I think it's kind of the broader holochain ethos as well, like you know, that things, people have agency of themselves and are not controlled by anyone else. They're all kind of masters of their own will and cooperate where they're intentionally cooperating, kind of thing. So
so your building blocks, I understood, were resources or assets and events. But what you're saying now is there's really this third building block, which is agents or people who take action.
yeah. Yeah.
And are they just the agents based on their use of holochain and being an agent in there? Or is there any other form of agency that you're describing in this?
Yeah, sure. There's a few different types. We're kind of seeing holochain agents and REA agents as roughly equivalent at the moment. But REA agents are kind of conceptually broader than holochain agents. Like you might have an app that remixes, that's got economic networks and activity happening between holochain and client server apps and hosted apps on other platforms and things. And you might consider yourself one agent across all of those apps with different identities on each. So it's not really a technical broader concept. It's more of a conceptually broad concept that, you know, we're talking about real people with places in many different contexts rather than each of those contexts as being an agent, if that makes sense.
Maybe. So if I'm an agent, then I can take actions and I can own resources or handle resources. Are they the basic things that I can do at any moment?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Like they're not so much represented in the system, except as identifiers a lot of the time, because it's kind of just like the ownership of the records as they're being written and manipulated a lot of the time. Like they're still obviously a central part of the thing. Like the whole vocab is resource event agent as being the core three pinnacles. But in terms of the actual system and the logic in it, it mostly centers around events and resources and processes, I suppose, being the other big one.
And
Yeah,
the having the data stored agent-centric, how does that get reflected in HoloREA? Like which things would just two agents, because they're related to it, capture, and which ones are published?
At this stage, because of the way I'm thinking about group agency and modularity in this, which I'll get to next, I'm tending to just store everything publicly in shared DHTs at the moment, and that be kind of like the shared space where people are holding things. So I haven't done a heap, like all the stuff that Guillaume has done with mutual credit of like private entries and then public attestations and that kind of stuff is not things I've done yet. And I don't know that really makes sense for this anyway, because you kind of want, the point is to have that data in the shared public space so that you have an objective record of what's been happening. But yeah, maybe the easy summary of it would be, it's about agents manipulating resources through events, sort of thing. So I'll show you, there's actually a section called on actions on the Value Flows website, and there's these 16 different verbs that are the possible actions that an event can take. So basically, these are the things that agents will do to resources in the economy. So they might produce a resource or use one or consume one. They might cite a resource. They might do work. So there's another part here that Value Flows considers work and skills and monies and other things as resources, as well as kind of production resources and natural resources. They're all considered resources and quantifiable, so they can be tracked as they flow. So from the online accounting space and contributive accounting kinds of things, having the skills tracked as resources is what enables you to do all your kind of non-financial management, because you just, you track that you did some work, and there'll be some classification you give to the skills that you're doing in your work. So, I mean, actually, if I just look at my Hilo profile, it's that kind of thing. Like, all these little skills up here. Like that's on Hilo, that's my ontology of all the skill resources that I'm using and contributing to the community. And you can just measure those in hours, or you can measure those in like the number of products that have been delivered, or however the collective wants to measure it. So it's getting into a little bit of a rabbit hole now, but does that help clarify some of that stuff for you?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Does anyone want to talk more about contributory accounting stuff or ask anything more on that before we leave the topic? Cool. Okay, we'll leave it. So CRISPR. Who was here for the CRISPR chat the other week? It was most of us, was it?
Yeah, it was.
Cool.
Yeah. But maybe just for people who might be watching, just you could share a couple of lines on CRISPR and Chimera. That would help.
Yeah, I'd like to do a round actually in people's perceptions of it. I think we might all have different ideas of what it is. I think for me, it was a very cool, easy to use compile time framework that lets you remix and reassemble holochain zones and build apps quickly. But but then it seemed to go a lot deeper and allow you to start, manipulating things on the fly and injecting UI and having totally different presentations of things depending on your user and the way you wanted to look into the window of data, which raised a whole bunch of really interesting things about Lisp machines and programmable interfaces and unlocking all this kind of crazy power in the interface layer that is all tied to this weave of robust distributed data. Yeah, that's my take on it. Anyone else want to share some thoughts?
I would echo that. Just say I kind of dumbed it down afterward. I was like, oh, it's a vending machine that makes vending machines. And then I could see the utility of if an app developer could quickly just replicate what they need to and then change what they wanted to. It's exciting.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the reasons I've been excited about it is just that it includes a whole bunch of non-devs. And that's always, like, any initiative in that direction to me is exciting. I feel like it definitely pushes the modularity conversation ahead. So it means, the focus isn't as much on creating apps or these silos, but actually communities that can use these very generic tech tools for what is important for them. And yeah, as I thought about it a little more, like, I feel like Philip has been, I guess that's how he views CRISPR, right? Like, he's looking at this as like the ultimate customization tool for someone like him who just wants his widgets and his chat tools perfected to his interests and his tastes. And so I'd be very interested to explore it more from a, like, collectives using it to build like a shared set of tools. And that's been my interest in CRISPR. And yeah, I hope to keep chatting with Philip about some of that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be useful for people like me that don't know Rust to be able to start building stuff and seeing how you should actually do it, because my experience of Rust is basically just the tutorials and any ways of getting actual working code and seeing how it's put together is going to be really useful.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for working examples, huh? I'm going to say that as well as someone that only picked up Rust about 6 months ago. Yeah, I might riff on that actually, because that's kind of this question that Sid put in the agenda of how REA fits into modular architectures like CRISPR. Actually, Sid, would you mind chucking the link to that recording in the chat just so that everyone has it? Because I think people like Kamal, who are more business and entrepreneurial, might find it really interesting as well. Yeah, So there's some stuff that I'm seeing that would be like incredibly useful for me, and it's kind of the same reasoning as you, Sam. Like, if I pull open, say, the process record, I can never quite remember which file it's in. I think it might be in the lib. Yeah,
Can you make it bigger again?
Yeah, sorry.
No.
Yeah, so where process links, just because of the way I've got the separate modules in HoloREA laid out, where process links to the input and output events, it's local within the same DNA, so it's zome to zome. So I'm using this helper method of mine, query direct index with foreign key. But the other ones, committed inputs and intended inputs that link into the planning module, they use a different helper here, query direct remote index with foreign key. And that's just because when you're linking stuff externally to a DNA versus internally, there's just a different set of links and things you need to set up to make that work. So something that would be really useful, maybe integrating things like this into Chimera, is that then you have the option of being able to kind of easily switch out and go, I want this to join to a local record versus a remote record. And there might be really easy ways to just flick a switch in the editor and template that. But the other thing, the other things about it that are quite interesting to me is basically that I'm running the path that I want to be using the most best practice, you know, fastest, robust techniques of how to drive this logic under the hood. And there's kind of a balance to take between what's the standard, you know, industry vetted way of doing it versus having a whole bunch of diversity and experimentation in new ways of doing it. But I'm not convinced the experimentation is for me. So, you know, if I was building HoloREA inside an environment like Chimera or CRISPR, it means that when there is new knowledge available and new state of the art as to how links should work, I just press a button and I have best practice deployed and I didn't have to change any code, you know. So that has a lot of value for me as well, I think. The other stuff I kind of want to touch on really briefly with it is, so there's this MoodleNet Commons Pub project that I showed you. This is all React, this one. Chris Dorian from BuildSort, they've been building amazing stuff and all their stuff is built on Angular. Shroom was React as well. All of the Chimera stuff that Philip's doing in Vue. So we've got this bit of diversity of the front-end languages. And what I kind of realized when I started looking at Svelte, for those who haven't seen it, it's a very user-friendly UI framework. Where it differs from all these other ones is that it's much more a compile time framework than a runtime framework. So it tries to just generate standard web components that don't need any more runtime to operate. The tutorial is fantastic. I really recommend going through it. I've had people that have literally never written a line of JavaScript before become totally comfortable writing apps with Svelte. Anyway, I dug into the code a bit and started this fork because I realized that somewhere in there, you know, there's actually this very simple template that takes what Svelte compiler generates and tries to turn it into the web component stuff with some observable logic. And I don't see any reason why you couldn't have multiple templates that output to Vue and React and did all this like just generation of standard components that work natively in those frameworks. So that's where I'd like to see the stuff that we're trying to do with value flows eventually converge on the stuff that Chimera is doing. And the VF UI project, if you look in the value flows GitHub repository, this is sort of the bare basic start of that. I haven't had much time to dive into it in depth. But at some point, we'd like to be building a storybook of components here that'll be deployable to any front-end framework without it needing to be fiddly. And that would really help with convergence, I think. And there's a few other UI projects, like the Hilo UI project is another one. Just all this stuff happening where you look at it all and you're like, we are building the same apps 10 times. Like this is all offers of once UI. It even has the same buttons under it. Like, so yeah, it's lots of room to deduplicate work there. The other thing that might be cool is set with CRISPR and Chimera is there was a lot of talk in the early days about embedding, sorry, not Jupyter, Juniper, the Rust GraphQL library as Zome, so that you can just query GraphQL straight out of HoloChain. But then it became this very complicated thing quickly of like, well, you have this one gateway for like 10 other DNAs, and how do you configure what the queries on that gateway look like to match those DNAs? So there's another thing kind of worth showing as well. I ended up building my own build system for this, but the GraphQL spec for value flows, it's set up like this where it's split into separate modules. And then in this bridging folder here, you have the files that are kind of included that join the modules together. So say here, like agent observation, these are the edges between which you can get from agents into the observation of what's going on in the network. So you can find all the events that an agent's logged or the resources in their inventory or whatever. Anyway, the point is that having that done in that modular way means that it might be kind of easy to wrap that up into Chimera and just go, you know, okay, you've got these 10 DNAs. That means you now have these 10 slices of GraphQL that generates you an API that just gets bundled into an app and you don't have to do anything. And that'd be pretty cool. I think we've been chasing that one for a while. Okay, yeah, that's enough on CRISPR.
Just on that note, related to CRISPR,
yeah.
Can I just add something or ask a question?
Go for it.
What's been interesting to me is like the HoloREA and CRISPR mashup, and what that, you know, I think you just summed up what that could actually produce for us, that ability to package and then, you know, roll out apps really quickly and efficiently. Do you think like we could be seeing HoloREA libraries? Like here's, I don't know, couple dozen different versions of mutual credit libraries that you could incorporate within your, you know, your ecosystem, or like here's like a shared supply chain protocol that you can plug into, or yeah. And I feel like that could start being really useful for people. So the question could be, what would that take, like, to start building in that way?
Not much, really. Like all of the core framework, there's this lib folder. This is probably way too tiny to read on my screen, sorry. But in the lib folder of the repository anyway, like each record type really is broken down into several modules that make it highly modular. Really, all I need to do is set up a build process and publish them to crates.io to start making those easily consumable. I just haven't done it yet because Holochain versioning is weird and I don't want to have the maintenance burden just yet. So if you want to get started early and you don't want to wait for me to do that, you could do it the way that I've been doing, which is just using Git submodules to reference things. So in this latest work I've been doing, there's this third-party folder, which is just a Git submodule that has the agent registration DNA that's in the Holochain OpenDev, and I'm using that in HoloREA now. And then inside of that, there's another submodule, which is the social triangulation zone, which does some gatekeeping stuff. So, you know, it's fiddly, but I'm just kind of dealing with it as an artifact of the realities of development at the moment, and it's not too bad. Publishing those modules.
Sorry.
No, you're right. Publishing those modules would be the first thing, and then, you know, this apps folder here can just really start being filled out with more of these kinds of special case things potentially, because you're really just talking about, in some cases, just configuration, and in other cases, just a tiny bit of customization for a particular use case. I guess it's really good self-documentation too, isn't it, to kind of help ground this very intellectually heavy abstract work into some more tangible pieces.
So a more conceptual question. How would you, like, let's say I wanted to use mutual credit for my project, like this is a simple mutual credit currency. How would you say, like is there a difference in approach between like the current mutual credit cap app that we've all, you know, been playing around with and that game's created, and say I wanted to adopt HoloREA?
There may be.
Yeah, what would that be?
I think I haven't gone deep enough to really be sure, but it definitely has a big impact on the way that you deal with conflict resolution and spending limits. Because if you were to do it as an REA deployment, really it would just be, you know, at this stage I wouldn't even bother coding a custom resource specification in the knowledge system, really, honestly. I would just have a few hard-coded resource classification URIs in the UI to say, I mean, you only need one probably to say mutual credit hour or credit or something. And just use that same resource type for all the resources. And
so that currency would be a resource? The mutual credit, each credit would be the resource?
Yep. And you would initialize it simply by, oh, that's not a great test actually.
I don't think it should be a resource, because that goes back to seeing money as a thing rather than it just capturing what happens.
Yeah, this is one of the ideological places where value flows doesn't take any position. You know, it's meant to be both a next economy protocol, but also a transitional economy protocol. So it's just like, yeah, you know, people have money. It's a reality of the world. We don't care. You can just treat it as a resource and map it like any other. I mean, maybe you could define it as an hour and have a time bank rather than a mutual credit system that tries to have some abstract value.
That's what feels like if it's switched around, if the credit clearing processes decide which resources to use as a measuring thing, like is it the hours, is it the avocados, what are we measuring, and then taking that through the different steps, that feels like it would work for the mutual credit.
Yeah. Has everyone got like another 10 minutes? I know we're up to the hour or so. I did want to get to some of the dynamic modularity stuff, but I do want to finish this conversation as well. Are we okay with that?
Let's take another 10 to 15 minutes, and 15 minutes, and yeah, if anyone needs to hang up or drop off, feel free to do so. Or should we say 20 minutes? What do you think, Pospi?
Oh, I think it's 10 or 15. We should be right.
Okay.
I don't have a heap to talk about in it. And actually, maybe it'd be better to have it as kind of a thinking point for next week. But yeah, just to finish on the mutual credit stuff, this would be basically the same call that you would use to initialize a new wallet for someone. So one of the core principles in value flows, Alex, that you almost touched on before, and I was going to mention, is that you never describe resources directly, really, in the protocol. You only describe the observations that agents have about those resources. And so there's this implication that nothing is actually real. It's just what someone said was happening, and you're deriving, you know, some truth about the resource from that. So to initialize a resource like a credit wallet for someone, what you're actually doing is logging an event. So create an economic event, and the event has a bunch of data in it, and the resource has a bit of metadata about initializing the resource. But it's basically like when you're initializing an inventory, you usually say that you're the provider and the receiver. Give it a point in time. Raise is the action verb that just means like you're raising the count in inventory. And then you give it a resource quantity, and if you're doing it as a mutual credit currency, you might take the unit off and not supply a unit and just, you know, initialize it as 0. And that's all you need to do. And then from there, you just start logging economic events where you're either where you're just logging transfer events, and you're either logging the provider as yourself and the receiver as the other person if you're sending them credit, or you're doing it the other way around if you're bringing it back. And there should be one down here somewhere that's kind of equivalent. There's a lot of stuff in here. Anyway.
This sounds so exciting.
So you just log the events, and the resource balance is figured out automatically for you.
Yeah, and I think what you could then do is to create a set of accounts for taxation purposes and stuff like that. You could specify the values of certain things, of hours or avocados or kilograms or whatever, and then use that on specific dates, basically like an exchange rate, and from that create a set of accounts based on who owns all the different resources at that point in time.
Yeah, you could do all kinds of stuff like that. I mean, it probably gets into Sid's reputation library territory fairly quickly too, that kind of stuff, I suspect.
Yeah, because that's also where my question came from. Like, as a business person or project driver, like someone's, you know, obviously going to be asking the question, why do I need REA accounting, right? And I think what you touched upon is why, like, as you start adding layers of complexity, like who has access to issue more credits? You know, maybe there's a reputation element to it. Maybe there's a hard limit that's set. You know, where can they port it to or spend it? And like those kinds of complexities, I feel like that's where REA starts becoming important. Is that a good way to summarize it?
Yeah. Okay. Whole systems thinker friend of mine that I used to work with, he had this insight that this was back in blockchain days, that, you know, most of the work we were doing was fundamentally about breaking down barriers to the flow of data and value. And I think that holds up as a pretty good core organizing principle. And so these kinds of things, you know, often an REA is like, it's like an aircraft carrier when you need a tin dinghy, you know. But just it creates that possibility to start integrating with more parties and having more virtuous feedback loops that, you know, empower and inform and create more value sort of almost exponentially fairly quickly when the data is shared right anyway.
Greg here real quick. So yeah, so from my perspective from these rural African villages, and I always kind of took this, I was thinking about maybe an event, right, where we take the measurement from the scale when people bring in their waste, you know, and just take that measurement from the scale and then that generate the value transaction. But now that you're talking about an entire kind of reputation, it solves another problem, because what we were doing, it sounds cool to put a waste to energy system in a rural village, but what ended up happening is a bunch of school children, every time I go up to the village, there's always these little field trips out into the bush to go get biomass to feed the grid. And you're like, damn it, now we're just using child labor. But if we, if you created a whole rep system that would incentivize people to turn in their own waste as opposed to sending the kids out, and then maybe that's where Guillem's meta value or his mutual credit system comes in, because it's been hitting me that we're going to have to gamify it, right? Like you would have to create a game where the villager would feel incentivized not to send his kid out to do that labor because he would want that credit, for his status. And so I started thinking about like this, to achieve these goals that we want of climate change, it's going to have a game, right? It's going to have to be gamified. And maybe that's where those value systems can come in, so people can have fun doing these proper behaviors.
Yeah, thanks for those reflections. It's really interesting to hear. Yeah, I have, having been through, it's Ada. Having been through the blockchain space where, the gamification rhetoric is very strong. There's a podcast, Daniel Schmachtenberger's The Generator Functions About Existential Risks, is a really good listen. Very long, but he kind of ends with some strong words specifically for the blockchain industry. And what I kind of boil it down to is, like when I said economies of knowledge at the start, another way to put it might be like sense-making economies. And I kind of find the idea of gamifying things and trying to use these incentive structures to encourage people to be very problematic mostly. Like there are cases where I've seen it come well, but it's so playing with fire and this dicey thing, of like, is the game itself oppressive? Like, I don't know. So I try and very much work towards just building systems that make the truth visible as much as possible and make things perceptible as much as possible. I don't know if you would have seen, there's some of them in that 2040 doco, like those sustainability dashboards they have for some, new age cities in America, and like this thing in a classroom with a big screen and all these dials and things saying how much water's been saved and recycled and all that stuff. And that's what I kind of feel like the underlying goal is with this work. It's like the cat's out of the bag, and no matter what happens now, there's going to be a whole bunch of big data and kind of, corporate interests are going to eventually come into ecosystems. There's going to be all kinds of weird manipulations. So it's like, how do we build systems that allow these little emergent things you're talking about? Like one of the nice parts about value flows is when you discover that the children are carrying the water, you can just start modeling that the children are carrying the water. You don't have to go and write new systems to do it. It'll all fit into the same database. So it's like, how are you creating more and more awareness of what's happening on an awareness that is meaningful to the people on the ground who are affected by it, so that you're actually protecting them against the repercussions of big data and AI and things that might be directing their behavior in ways that don't actually serve them at all. So yeah, I think that's an important part of the work.
Helpful.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, you brought some light into it, because yeah, it's all through governance, because a lot of these projects are tied to, like, the USAID is the one who funded it. So of course it has to fit into like the US foreign policy and, you know, goals and aims and things like that. So that always bends my view on certain things. But thanks, man. That was good.
Yeah, no worries. So back to mutual credit, just to tie that off, I can see, I mean, there's some other things here that, you know, you could do this and initialize your balance to this many. So you might want to put some validation on this to say that any initial inventorying has to start at 0, and that solves the initial problem. The other thing that's quite different in the way that GM has been doing things, mostly based on Matt Slatt's wisdom, I believe, like the idea of an event sourcing API is what they're called, for a mutual credit system, where you never actually store the balance as a distinct resource. You're only storing adjustments, and then you just look at all the adjustments and figure out the final balance. Whereas with HoloREA, in the way that the resources work inside, so that's initializing here. But this whole big set of logic here that kind of spiders out is where new events come in, and the resources that are stored in the system update in response to those events. So there's, you know, big stuff here around like updating the quantity based on the quantities of the event and decrementing what's in the resource and stuff. But what that means is that because I'm doing that, there's then something being written into the DHT every time, which means that if there is a fork in the DHT and 2 people do different balances, you will get a conflict. And at some point, I believe what will happen is HoloChain will actually kind of pop a system dialog and make you resolve it. Whereas you wouldn't get that with GM's implementation as it stands, because he's not actually storing the resource. He's just, it's read heavy and just deriving the resource from the events.
Yeah.
And I don't know which way is better, you know, like I think it's maybe different use cases, different ideas. And I wonder whether there might be some future reason to have a flavor of HoloREA that doesn't store the resources and just dynamically generates them each time.
Yeah, and I feel like that might be the way to go, just offering more flavors and options for communities. Like maybe there are communities that don't care about people's balances. But anyway, I think you're right. Like we can close it at that for now, and like use this as a gateway for future conversations.
Yeah.
This topic I meant.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're at 1:15, so I won't go into this last bit too much, and it's probably premature anyway. But I just want to show everybody in the HoloREA repository under this branch. Oops, come back. Under this branch for agent registration work, I've just put in a test that's mostly a style, but I'll start trying to flesh out more with Lynn and Bob. But cross-border trade was something that we talked about, well, actually with Beef Ledger, we prototyped, and you know, it worked and it kept the investors happy kind of thing, but there's prototypes and there's prototypes, and it was sort of doing a lot of silly tricks to pretend in some ways. So this is me starting to try to define that more clearly and use as an example of what a runtime customization of a modular system would look like. So this is kind of the opposite, well, not the opposite, but just different to the way Chimera does it, where it's all compile time. And I never actually, where is this? I never actually finished the diagram, but it kind of gives enough of an idea, maybe just to summarize. This one. So we can ignore this on the right for now. Let's just focus on this diagram here. So this is the standard configuration for HoloREA, and if you look at the I'll just do it in my code base. If you look at the conductor config file in the root of the HoloREA folder, this one, this configuration here is the one that I've put in a diagram here. So you have this, we've talked about lobbysomes as a pattern a fair bit, and the agent zome is kind of the lobbysome for HoloREA at the moment. It's where all the agents kind of come together and it controls the access, although at the moment doesn't control anything, it's a free game. So then you've got these four other ones here that are kind of the central ones in the example that I'm toying with. So observation is the economic ledger of all the things that have been observed to happen. Planning is the planning space where people can put out offers and requests and commit to them and make it all kind of start moving. And proposal is a separate space where basically the functionality is to take a whole bunch of individual requests for economic activity and turn them into a big proposal that actually means something to a person. So that's the standard config anyway. And then where these arrows here are all kind of scribbling around was where I was starting at looking at splitting them out and having more of them and pointing at each other in different ways. But if you take a look at this this test, it runs through a bit of conductor setup in a way that I think makes this actionable. But I won't know until I get through the test. So maybe by next week, we'll be able to talk through this in some detail. I'll just run through it really quickly. So as you can see, there's a few constants up here, some of these vocab things. Then I'm generating out all the DNAs. So this is the DNA ID in my build system, and this is the name that I'm giving it. So I'm basically spinning up a bunch of different networks that are all totally isolated. So there's these 3 ones that are all going to work together for the customer's original network. We've got some for an export company, a subcontractor that the export company might hire. This is an import official doing customs checks at the border, and this is a courier on the destination country actually delivering the original order to the customer. Sorry, I'm talking so fast to get this through this. So spinning up all these DNAs, and then the next interesting thing is coming into each of the individual agents in the group and mixing and matching which of those network spaces they're in. So the customer here, I've called this their native network with agent planning and proposal, which is where eventually, I'll show you when we get down there, which is where they'd put out an initial order that they want to buy some avocados. But I've also given them access here to the observation network that the courier company uses and the observation network that the import official uses, so that they can check into those networks to do audits on the data that's in there. And the others are all, similar but different. So the exporter has access to this sub network where they're handling a contractor. The contractor has access back into their planning network to kind of mark the job as complete. Anyway, I'll let you have a look at it and go through it at your own time. But I hope this is starting to make it clear from a code perspective what this kind of dynamic modularity means and makes possible. Because now what we're looking at here is actually this quite complicated arrangement where you've got someone in a far country coordinating with people all across the supply chain to get something delivered, and bits of that supply chain being hidden in, bits that are happening in the destination country not being shared with the origin country. I mean, the original use case of this was China, where data sovereignty is very strict and they don't like things leaking back out of the border. So yeah, all of that in there works and should work, and maybe a simple and, well, a reasonably simple and straightforward thing to end on is the first phase of this, which is the customer placing the order on the marketplace. And you can see here, there's basically 3 records that they create to do that. There's 2 intents and a proposal. And so the intents do the offers and requests. So this first one here is the they're requesting to have someone transfer it to them, so they're the receiver. They want some avocados. They want 1,000 kilograms of those avocados, and it's due on a particular day. And then they have another intent saying that they're offering to transfer, and so they're the provider, this $12,000 US for that ton of avocados. And then this proposal here, when we go and link them like this, that's what basically ties all those individual low-level economic requests that I was mentioning together into this proposal that says I want to trade. And it, yeah, as is the powerful nature of this model, like it's a fair few entries to add just to do that. But what you get with it is this power that if you wanted, you could do any kind of weird multilateral trade where you might, there might actually be like a whole bunch of different intents here that are optional of different things you might want in return. Or you might be trading, 2 different kinds of resources for 3 other kinds, or like, it's all very open-ended. And then there's kind of a whole process that would ensue. And I've sort of stubbed out what the processes would be here. But all these things can be done just by the authoring of different REA records and collaborating together across networks, I think. So yeah, that'll be an interesting one to talk through next week, hopefully, when it's had a bit more time to be fleshed out.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and I think just to add a comment, I feel like this is something the holochain community as well has been struggling with recently, like the complexity of who accesses who, and I feel like some of this lobby DNAs are really simplistic, and using some of what you've created to build that standard would be really helpful, because I feel like everyone, or else you might just get like these really divergent patterns, which will lead to the silo problem once again. Yeah, so I feel like some kind of convergence on those issues might be helpful. And if that's what you're working on right now, I'd love to jump in and help, like especially the lobby patterns, the group agent patterns, like all of that would be awesome.
Yeah, it's a totally wild, like wild card thing to end on, but just thinking about CRISPR and Chimera and where it is, and this group forming around that open dev collective that Guillaume has started, it makes me wonder, like, should I just dissolve HoloREA? Like, why do we need it to be a separate org? Like we've all kind of seen through the veil of this Lisp machine and the pieces that are needed to build the operating system for the new internet. So it kind of feels to me like this is all the same project now, that we're all building these little pieces towards some quite enormous vision. So just something to ponder for next week.
So I'm interested that you brought it up, because I've been thinking about like a reclassification as well, but I feel like it's more like a broadening of the scope of REA, like as opposed to just material goods moving about, and maybe it doesn't maintain the name REA, but I feel like it could be expanded to like movement of, or like pathways or channels
REA,
for. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
REA has enough trouble not becoming a conquering force with this universal grammar, so I think things that could not be called REA is probably the way to go.
Yeah, but I think anyway, I guess that's a good conversation. I'd love to get into it with you. But I think there's something here worth chatting about and exploring. What you just brought up, because I feel, irrespective of the name, like. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say a good portion of the modules in our list are, things like file management and comments and tags and all these sort of generic building blocks that have nothing to do with REA. Necessary augmentations to make it really powerful.
Yeah, I kind of feel like the organizational prowess that you've developed through REA is what's critical. Like that ability to, and I feel like that could be the shared knowledge and the shared pattern that we all pick up. But anyway, I think that's probably worth another discussion. So before we close, anything else you'd like to add, Pospi? Or I'd also love to, like, invite maybe just a word or two from everyone on what they'd like to explore next week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe a word or two on what was your favorite bit you got out of this session, or if there was a thing you really didn't see that you wanted to hear about, that would be good to know too. Yeah, I'm complete. Over to the others.
I like
You
the
want to
last
facilitate
part
that?
oh, go ahead.
I'm quite interested in what you're talking about, Pospi, because it seems like you're writing an underlying engine for what I'm interested in, which is loconomics. So most of what a loconomics platform would need seems to me what you're actually building. So that's pretty cool.
Thanks. I just popped the value equation concepts deck in the chat as well. It's training material for Sensorica's older system, and there's some good stuff about how they use that. I know forget who was it, Michael, the other one who's doing peer-to-peer stuff. Contributory economies might be interested in it because it's just one way of leveraging REA data to do this kind of thing, but it's basically an algorithm that takes all of the resource tracking you've done and turns that into an income share effectively.
This is Kamal. Yeah, I feel like, it was a really good kind of review of the code and just to look, behind the scenes a bit. What I would love to do, I think someone mentioned, how do we connect it to UI? It'd be great to have little, I think because the concepts are quite complex, maybe we could start with like some visuals first and then see how does this work, so I would love to help make that happen.
Hey, Greg here. I was going to say another thing that, I mean, both of these last two meetings have just blown my mind, but I know of two projects in Senegal where they're taking human waste and turning it into energy. So as you're talking about tracking that resource, I started thinking, it's always felt like what forensic data could you glean off of the waste of a community, the human waste of a community in public health. And then, yeah, thanks again for the challenge to the ideas. And I can see where you get in those loops in your own efforts and your own principles. That was really cool to watch and observe.
I can share for me the bit about mutual credit, how it maps onto some of the patterns that we've been exploring together, and the conversation in the next few weeks about how this can all come together in a more convergent fashion. Like, that's interesting to me. Like, I'd love to explore that with you.
Yeah, for me, it was very helpful to see the specific scenario you was showing in the end of like typical examples and how the offers would be made and all the flows would be organized. Yeah, and yeah, all this stuff like seeing the code and seeing all this makes me want to look more into it. It feels very interesting, so it's cool. I missed the first 20-25 minutes, so I'll be watching the recording to catch up. But thanks for the presentation.
Cool. Any other thoughts, or should we close? Maybe we can.
I've got an idea. So I just want to say thank you, Pospi. It's a very ambitious project. And about the note about feeling like dissolving it, I really see how this could evolve into a common solution for like a language in between many different apps, specifically for Sid mentioned like logistics, but also for this kind of growing issue of ecological accounting, you might say, and finding a way to convert ecological measures to economic measures. and finding like a way to open source that project that people can contribute to, maybe with that sensor, like microsensor logistic language, and just like having this huge database that we're collecting on a common language that can allow for ecological measures of embodied energy. The emergy concept has been interesting to me lately. The work of Odom, I believe his name, and yeah, just something like that that could be a common language for logistics and ecology. I'd see that as like a real interesting use case for this. And so yeah, thank you for this work and the examples.
Thanks you. I've chucked some links in the chat for you while you were talking, because there's a friend who's doing his PhD in aquaculture, regenerative aquaculture, and he's got someone working with him who's working on this tech called discrete global grid systems, I believe. And it just, I mean, having done a fair bit of GIS stuff, that looks like a really serious piece of heavy lifting for the ecological, like bioregional kind of data stuff. Yeah, worth having a look to.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, guys. Maybe we can close with that. And if any of you have any suggestions on topics for next week, just message me and we can take it from there.
Cool. Thanks all. Thanks for showing up.
Thanks
See
to
you next week.
everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Pospi.
Bye.